So this coming Sunday, we're going to be celebrating communion together. And we're continuing in something that I introduced at our annual general meeting last Sunday. And that's the idea of connections. We cannot exist within the community of Christ, within the community that Christ wants us to be in together, without forming genuine connections with one another. It's absolutely critical. And yet what I found so interesting is that in Corinthians, when Paul was talking to the Corinthian church about communion, he actually spent more time talking about their connections with each other. Listen to what he said right off the get-go when it came to introducing the topic of communion. He said, "In the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good." What a lead in to talking about communion. Guys, it is so bad when you get together, it'd be better if you didn't. Wow. I can't even imagine writing that, expressing that to a congregation and saying, you know what, when you get together, it basically hurts more than it helps. That's wild. He continues on, it's probably a good thing. And he says, "In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it." So he's hearing something, and to the degree that he has enough knowledge of what is happening in the church, he said, you know what? I buy it. I believe what I'm hearing. He said, "No doubt there have to be some differences among you to show which of you have God's approval." Interesting way of putting that. He said, there's going to be divisions. But one of those things that divisions show is whether you have God's approval or not. Those who have God's approval will obviously differ from those who don't. Now, what is he getting at when he's saying that? Approval sounds like it's sort of a loose term, but it isn't. In the Greek, when you use that expression, God's approval, it literally means to be examined by God and to come out having been tested and shown genuine. The thing that is really interesting about that is that when Paul is talking to the church, he's saying God literally looks at you and creates a division in his mind as to those who are approved and those who aren't. It reminds us a lot of what Jesus said would happen when we stand before the Father and the Father separates people into the sheep and the goats. The term examination is to come under a light that reveals the content of the individual when you're talking about a person. I worked in a vinegar plant when I was going through college. And while I say it was a vinegar plant, it wasn't the only thing that was made there. There was a whole lot of time invested in the company in making maraschino cherries. But one part of the production of the maraschino cherries that I had zero involvement with, and I'm so glad, was this. They all, and I mean all, every single cherry, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, were all individually examined. Ugh. I can't even picture myself doing that for an 8-hour shift. But what you had were literally tables and tables of workers that would sit there, and the cherries would be spread out on these tables, and the tables had a light that shone through a translucent piece of plexiglass or something. And what it did was it served to show the quality of the cherries as they were being passed over. If they had a pit or if they had blemishes, it would become readily apparent. As that light shone on them, they would either pass or fail the test. In the same way, Paul is saying, guys, God examines us. He looks at us and he brings forward this idea of having God's approval or not. And if we're going to come together as believers, for those who have God's approval, they will, pass the test, so to speak. And, we don't often like to talk this way because we want to talk in terms of grace. And, we don't want to talk about legalistic righteousness, because what we're really saying is that, if we meet with God's approval, it's not us, it's God's work in us. But if we don't meet God's approval, then something in us has not been allowed or not been permitted to be changed by God. We're resisting that change. And so as a result, put all of these people together in one room, and there's a divide. Those who God's approval rests on and those who don't. Then imagine those people trying to get along. It's no wonder Paul said, you've got some divisions. And he would have an easy time believing it, knowing the content that he was sharing, knowing that God examines the hearts and minds of those who claim to follow him. This isn't meant to be a downer, but maybe it'll be perceived that way. Can I suggest that maybe what we really need to do is, rather than look at this and go, oh, but, what about grace? What about, all of us being one happy family? What we really need to look at is, if God shines his light on me, what is he seeing? What is he seeing? That's what we're going to be focusing on this coming Sunday, February 16th. God bless.